Hi, welcome to your Statistical Process Control online classes. In this video, we'll finish the content of Chapter 2. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Now that we understand the power of flowcharts to map a process, let's explore in details the main elements present in a classical flowchart. The starting point of the process is indicated by an oval, and each processing step is indicated by a rectangle, which contains a brief description of the relevant operations to be done. The arrowed lines are used to connect symbols and to inform to which direction information flows. A rectangle with a wave bottom line refers to information recorded from a particular operation in the process, like for example, computer files. A point where the process branches because of a decision that must be taken is represented by a diamond, which can lead to another operation, or for example to the end of the process, which is also represented by an oval. A process can also contain useful complementary information, which should not be necessarily included in a parallelogram as a part of the process information. For a complete description of the process, it's important that all operations in the rectangles and all decisions in the diamonds should be connected from the start to the end oval. If the flowchart cannot be drawn this way, then the process is not fully characterized. Now, we are going to point out some relevant flowchart features that we must be able to recognize before constructing them. First, we need to make sure that the beginning, the end, and all other boundaries of the process are clearly understood before we start flowcharting. And this will be relatively easy once all outputs and customers, inputs, and suppliers are clearly identified. It's also important to make sure that we include all work connected with the process to be studied. It's important to include not only the formal activities, but also the informal ones. But at the same time, we should avoid including unnecessary or irrelevant activities, just to keep the flowchart as clean as possible. Then we need to make sure that every single operation in the flowchart has clearly identifiable inputs and outputs. For the sake of simplicity, try to consider only the relevant inputs and outputs for each operation. Another important feature is that each decision diamond should have only two outputs, which are labeled as yes and no or pass and fail. This means that this structure involves a logical output regarding the next steps in the process. We can see in this figure here an example of a classic flowchart for part of a process of contact lens conversion. Clearly, we can use most of the classical flowchart elements here, but it can also make some adaptation when it's convenient. For example, when we need to include complementary information regarding the measure we should record for a specific operation, or about how to proceed with the inspection of the lens, instead of using parallelograms, we can simply include some simple captions in order to keep the flowchart as clean as possible. It's also important to make some comments about how we can use flowcharts to analyze an existing process, to identify possible bottlenecks, and then propose improvements. For this purpose, a group of people with knowledge about the process should follow the simple steps. In step number 1, they should first draw flowcharts of the existing process as it is. Then, in step number 2, they should draw charts of the flow that the process could or should follow, or as it could or should be. And lastly, in step number 3, they have to compare the two sets of flowcharts to highlight the sources of problems or waste, improvements required, or any changes necessary. A critical examination of the first set of flowcharts is often required, using a technique which follows a well-established sequence of questions to examine: the purpose for which, the sequence in which, the place at which, the people by which, and the method by which. This sequence of topics form a comprehensive way to understand activities that are currently undertaken in the process, with the aim to eliminate, combine, rearrange, or simplify those activities. We can easily note here that the first list of topics is to understand the process as it is, and the second one is to act on the process to improve it. Now, let's try to translate each of these two lists of topics to a sequence of questions that we can ask about the process. We start with the topic purpose for which in the understand list. The questions to be asked here are: what is actually done or achieved by that particular activity in the process? Why is this activity necessary at all? And what else might or should be done with that activity? By answering these questions, we'll be able to act to eliminate unnecessary parts or operations of the process. Next, let's address the topic sequence in which, in a very similar way. Questions can be developed involving the time sequence of operations in the process, like when a specific activity or operation is done, why it is done at that specific time in the process, and when it might or should be done. Then the next topic is the place at which, and the valid questions here are about where an activity in the process is being done, why it is being done at that specific place, and where else it might or should be done. And lastly, we can address the people by which topic by asking questions about who does the specific activity, why this activity is done by that person or group, and who else might or should do it. By answering collectively all those questions, we'll be able to act to combine where it's possible or rearrange operations in the process for more effective results. And the last topic in the understand list regards the method by which. Like in the other topics, we can develop very similar questions, such as how a specific activity in the process is done, why it is done that way, and how else it might or should be done. By answering these questions, we'll be able to act to simplify operations in the process. Now, before we wrap this chapter up, let's briefly make some additional comments on the importance of flowcharting on the development and redesign of the process. As described in the first video of this chapter, any business process design or redesign project should begin with the definition of the mission of the organization and the identification of the critical success factors. In fact, quality managers have made striking improvements in customer satisfaction in short periods of time, often by following the simple steps of process analysis using teamwork. The first step is documenting and flowcharting the process, which has the power to make visible the invisible aspects and details of the process. This is the first critical step that helps an organization to see how the work is really being done, and not the way one thinks or believes it should be done. As we learned earlier, seeing the process as it is provides a baseline from which we can measure, analyze, test, and prove it. The next step is to identify the process customers and their requirements, and then establish effective metrics for these requirements. This step is extremely valuable, since recognizing that satisfying customer is a shared purpose. All suppliers need to know what customers expect and how their processes can be worked to meet customer expectations. In the next step, we should be able to analyze the process and rank all problems and opportunities for improvement. And the most effective way to accomplish this task is collecting supporting data. This will allow us to weigh the value that each task adds to the total process and then to select areas with the best opportunities for improvement and to spot unnecessary work in the process. Once we are able to select the areas that need urgent improvement, then the next step is to identify the root cause of the problems and establish control systems to suppress those problems. And in order to do this, we need to clarify the source of errors or defects, particularly those that cross department lines, and address proper corrective actions. Then next, we need to develop implementation plans for the recommended changes, which will involve all stakeholders, including the process management and operation teams. Now it's the right time to convince anyone involved with the process that it should be that way. After that, we should be able to perform pilot changes and revise the process by validating the effectiveness of the actions for the intended effects. This leads to reinforcement of the new process strategy and also to new levels of performance. And finally, we need to measure the performance of the new process using appropriate metrics. This is extremely important because once the process has been analyzed in this way, it should be possible to develop metrics for measuring the performance of its operations, activities, and tasks. All of these must be meaningful in terms of the inputs and outputs of the process, and in terms of the customers and suppliers as well. With that, we have finished chapter 2. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.